Good evening, good vach. Welcome to Adar, the month of Adar. Welcome to AT Daily on a Saturday night. Beautiful way to start the week with some beautiful learning. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Melissa in Great Neck, Nancy, North Carolina, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California, Guy in Ohio, Bill in mid-Missouri would appreciate prayers regarding my PhD applications. I've gotten 2 of 3 back as rejections. Only my first choice school is left and the tea leaves on it are decidedly mixed. Bill, may you only hear good news. We say amen. Shandora in the Bronx. Hi, I'm in Florida. Spencer in Connecticut. Welcome, everybody. It's late. It's not as late as it's gonna be. Next week will be the last time that it's like at this schedule. So got on the air about 7:40 today, a little after. We'll aim for about the same next week, and then the clocks change after that, and I'll just be in awe all spring and summer. The people on the East Coast who tune in on Saturday night well past midnight. Wow, there's so much merit for you. Because you're taking your learning so seriously and at fixed times. I was walking with a friend to Shul earlier today, and he does a lot of learning. He's doing Daf Yomi, and he has other learning things that he does too, but he doesn't do it at fixed times, right? And except on Saturday afternoon is his fixed time. That's when at the same time every week he learns, I forget what he's learning on Saturday afternoons. But I thought to myself, well, Baruch Hashem, we have fixed times of learning, very regular schedule. Every now and then I have to travel, of course, and I apologize for that, but we'll be making it up. And in general, the vast majority, 99% of the time, we have a very fixed schedule, and thank God we have this opportunity to learn together. Okay. Our daf tonight is page 62 here in Tractate Sanhedrin, 24th volume of the Talmud, making our way through chapter 7, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 8, which is about the prohibitions and penalties associated with idolatry, one who commits the transgression of idolatry. We picked this up near the top of page 62a. Rabbi Zakkai taught the following baraisa before Rabbi Yochanan. If one sacrificed an animal as an idolatrous offering, like sacrificed an animal to an idol, clear idolatry, or in Hebrew, avodah zarah, and burned incense as an idolatrous offering, another clear example of idolatry, but 2 different actions, and he poured a libation to an idol, and he bowed to an idol, all 4 definite forms of idolatry. And he did that all in the course of 1 lapse of awareness, meaning that he forgot that these actions were prohibited. He didn't have an intention to commit the sin of idolatry. He thought it was permitted. He just forgot. Okay? So, according to Rabbi Zakkai, he is obligated to bring only 1 sin offering. He is not obligated to bring an offering for each and every act of idol worship. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, go out and teach it outside. Meaning, you're completely wrong. Such a baraisa must not be taught in the study hall, as the halacha is that one is obligated to bring an offering for each and every act of idol worship. Worth noting, something I read, Rabbi Avigdor Miller kind of reminding us, because you make that mental picture. When you talk about the study hall of the sages, a base midrash, right, a house of study, what do we think of when we think of a house of study? A house full of books, right? If you go to base midrash Hancock Park or the base midrash of Eitz Chaim over here down the street, books everywhere. The Hasidic Kollel up the street, books everywhere. Any house of Jewish learning, books everywhere. But in the old days, it was all oral law. First of all, they didn't have books the way we know them. That would be called a codex, a book with a spine, etc., like this. That was unknown in the ancient world. If it was a book, it was a scroll. But really, the only things that were written down were the Torah, the prophets, the writings like Psalms, Proverbs, etc. The rest of it was all memorized. Now, by the year 200, when Rebbe said we have to write down the Mishnayos, write down the Mishna, because of the incredible danger of the Roman persecution, and there's danger that this will be forgotten and lost. Okay, so we're going to have to write down some of it. Some of it, very coded, very brief. But really, the experience of being in the study hall was the rabbis and the students learning everything out loud, and sometimes standing up. Right? According to Rabbi Miller, some of that was done standing up out of respect to God and the Torah and their teacher. Not all of it, because we've read in the Gemara that they had benches in the study hall. But at any rate, it was all done orally, right? The sparks were flying orally. And the teacher didn't stand at the front like me with a book in his hand, right? He was giving over what he had learned from his rabbi. And while books are wonderful, infinitely better than nothing, what was important about learning from a teacher and not from a book was obviously the give and take with the teacher and the personality of the teacher, but also the model, the role model of the teacher. These were saints. I mean, these were incredibly righteous, holy people, and learning at their feet, so to speak, you were learning much more than what they were teaching, the content that they were teaching. There was also the form that they taught and the manner in which they carried themselves. And that's why you just have to surround yourself with people that you respect. You have to find people to be around that you respect, and you want to learn from their midos, their attributes, their personal characteristics. Because when we're around such people and aspire to live a more righteous, more generous, more kind, more respectful life, if we're around such people, we'll do better at it. All right, let's get back to it. So Rabbi Yochanan said, go out and teach that outside. You're completely wrong about this. So Rabbi Abba says that which Rabbi Zakkai says is subject to a Tanaitic dispute between Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Nosson, as it is taught in a Baraisa. Okay, now we're going to do, we're doing one of those lessons where it's logic, right? We have to follow the logic here. And we're going to be comparing transgressions involving desecration of Shabbos to transgressions involving avodah zara during a lapse of awareness, right? And there's different kinds of lapse of awareness. With Shabbos, right, you can forget that such and such an action like cooking is prohibited on Shabbos. Somehow you forgot that. So if you did it, it wasn't with the intention of violating Shabbos. It's that you forgot that cooking was prohibited on Shabbos. So therefore you could bring a sin offering. A sin offering was for unwitting transgression. If you did it intentionally, it's a bigger sin, and you're going to have to atone for it. But bringing a sin offering is not available to you. A sin offering, a chatas, is only available for an unwitting transgression. So you could transgress Shabbos by doing something that's prohibited on Shabbos because you forgot that was prohibited. You forgot that cooking was prohibited on Shabbos, but you knew it was Shabbos. Or you maybe forgot that it was Shabbos. You knew that cooking was prohibited on Shabbos, but you didn't know it was Shabbos. You slept for 3 days, something happened, and you didn't know that day was Shabbos. So then there's going to be a difference, if you cooked and you drove your car and you lit a fire all on Shabbos. So that's 3 different kinds of transgressions. There's going to be a different outcome if you forgot that those things were prohibited on Shabbos or if you forgot that it was Shabbos. Likewise, there's different categories of avodah zara. So if you forgot that these things constituted avodah zara and you did all these different things, is it one sin offering because you just forgot the general category of avodah zara, or is it multiple sin offerings? It sounds like Rabbi Zakkai said, okay, you did multiple violations of avodah zara, of idolatry, but it was all one lapse of awareness, and so you're going to bring only one sin offering. Rabbi Yochanan is saying to him, no, you're going to need to bring multiple sin offerings in that situation. And now we're going to compare that to the result in a Shabbos example, like I just mentioned. So Rabbi Abba says that which Rabbi Zakkai says is subject to a dispute between the Tanaim, Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Nassim. As it is taught in a Baraisa, the prohibition against kindling a fire on Shabbos was singled out from the general category of labor prohibited on Shabbos, right? In the Torah says, you shall do no work on Shabbos. You shall rest on Shabbos. You shall not do work on Shabbos. But then it says you shall not kindle a fire on Shabbos. So kindling a fire is one of the 39 categories of prohibited labor on Shabbos. Why was it specified if we already know that all manner of labor is forbidden on Shabbos, including kindling a fire? They're going to have a disagreement over why kindling was mentioned specifically. Okay, so why was it singled out from the general category of labor prohibited on Shabbos? And it is written explicitly in the Torah, in the verse, Exodus 35:3, you shall not kindle fire in all your dwelling places on the day of Shabbos. And this was done to teach that the prohibition against kindling a fire on Shabbos is unlike other prohibited labors, as it is an ordinary prohibition for which one is not liable to the death penalty by stoning. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosei, as opposed to all the other categories of work on Shabbos, that if you were warned, etc., you could be liable to the death penalty for desecrating Shabbos. That's Rabbi Yosei. And Rabbi Nassim says, kindling a fire is like any other labor prohibited on Shabbos. It would have the same penalties associated with it. And it was singled out to divide the prohibited labors of Shabbos. In other words, by stating one prohibited labor separately, the Torah teaches that each labor performed on Shabbos constitutes its own separate prohibition. Consequently, one who unwittingly violates several categories of labor is obligated to bring a sin offering for each and every act of prohibited labor. Right? So each and every act of prohibited labor, now this is being brought down in this context, that Rabbi Nassim's view would support Rabbi Yochanan, who says if you did 4 different kinds of avodah zarah in one lapse of awareness, thinking that all those things were permitted, you would have to bring separate sin offerings for each one. Rabbi Abba concludes, according to the one who says that all of the labors that are prohibited on Shabbos, kindling fire was singling of all the labors that are prohibited on Shabbos, kindling fire on Shabbos was singled out to be mentioned in the Torah to teach that it is an ordinary prohibition. That would be the view of Rabbi Yosei. Then bowing in the category of idol worship, which is mentioned explicitly in the verse, you shall not bow to them nor worship them, at Exodus 20 verse 5, was singled out for the same reason, to teach that bowing is an ordinary prohibition, which is not punishable by stoning, but presumably bringing an offering to an idol or burning incense for an idol would incur liability for the death penalty by stoning. Whereas, according to the one who says that kindling a fire on Shabbos was singled out to divide the prohibited labors of Shabbos, Rabbi Nassim's view, bowing was also singled out with respect to avodah zarah for a similar purpose, to divide the rites of idol worship, i.e. to teach that one who unwittingly performs several forms of idol worship is obligated to bring a sin offering for each and every act of idol worship. Therefore, the Baraisa taught by Rabbi Zakkai, which states that such a person is obligated to bring only one sin offering, is in accordance with the former opinion, i.e. the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, and presumably Rabbi Yochanan, his opinion accords with that of Rabbi Nassim. Now, Rav Yosef objects to this whole analysis. He says, perhaps Rabbi Yosei says there, with regard to the laws of Shabbos, that kindling a fire was singled out to teach that it is an ordinary prohibition only because he derives the division of labors on Shabbos, i.e. that one is obligated to bring an offering for each and every category of labor that he violated, from a different verse. He agrees that you're going to bring multiple sin offerings. He just derives that from a different verse. Namely, Leviticus 4:2. And the phrase within that verse, from one of them. What does Leviticus 4:2 say? As it is taught in Baraisa, that Rabbi Yosei says with regard to the verse, quote, if anyone shall sin through error in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, and performs from one of them. Okay, that verse, which is actually taught with respect to the Kohen Gadol, but he's going to learn out from it that there are times when one is liable to bring one sin offering for all of his transgressions together, and there are other times when one is liable to bring bring one sin offering for each and every transgression. Right? Multiple sin offerings, one for each and every transgression. So there are different situations. What's it going to depend on? Rabbi Yonason says, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Yosei? As it is written, quote, and performs from one of them. And Rabbi Yosei interprets the verse like this. The word one, this is qualified as the verse states from one. And likewise, the word them is qualified as the verse states of them. Okay? So what are we going to learn out? Rabbi Yosei derives that there are cases of one transgression. Sounds like it's individual, but right, there are cases of one transgression that with regard to punishment is them, i.e. many, and there are cases of them, i.e. multiple transgressions, that with regard to punishment are one, right? That you would bring one sin offering for multiple transgressions, and there are other cases where one transgression is going to result in multiple offerings. How so? The Rabbi Yonason delineates the implementation of this principle with regard to the laws of Shabbos. One complete violation. For example, a case where one wrote a whole word as he intended, such as the name Shimon. Now, if you write on Shabbos, you have desecrated Shabbos. You have violated the prohibition of working on Shabbos. Writing is considered a form of working, which is prohibited on Shabbos. So if you wrote the word Shimon, which is a name, someone's name Shimon, if you wrote that word, you would certainly have violated Shabbos. The term from one is referring to a case where one performed only part of a complete act of labor. For example, he only wrote some of the letters of the word, such as the first two letters, Shin and Mem, from the name Shimon. Now, these two letters spell a word by themselves, Shem, which is name, the word name. In such a case, one is obligated to bring an offering for his transgression of writing two letters, Shin and Mem, even though he did not complete his intended act of writing the entire name of Shimon. He meant to write Shimon. He never completed that, but he did write two letters. In this case, they spell a word, but I believe even if they don't spell out a word, if you write two letters on Shabbos, you have violated Shabbos. Rabbi Yonason continues, them is referring to the primary categories of labor. The term of them includes the subcategories of labor. So the cases of one transgression that with regard to punishment is them, i.e. it is counted as many transgressions, are those involving intention. Back to where we're talking about lapse of awareness. So i.e. awareness on the part of the transgressor that it was Shabbos, versus unawareness on the part of the transgressor that the acts of labor that he was performing are prohibited on Shabbos. One who transgresses in this way is obligated to bring a sin offering for each and every category of labor that he engages in. The cases of them, several transgressions that with regard to punishment are those involving unawareness on the part of the transgressor that it was Shabbos, and intention, i.e. awareness that the acts of the labor that he was performing are prohibited on Shabbos. One who transgresses in this way is obligated to bring only one offering. So, if you knew that it was Shabbos, but you didn't know that these things are prohibited, and so you wrote and you made a fire and you drove a car, so then you knew it was Shabbos, but you didn't know that those things are prohibited on Shabbos, you forgot, lapse of awareness, then for each one of them, you're going to have to bring a sin offering when the temple is standing and it's possible to bring a sin offering. On the other hand, if you didn't know it was Shabbos, but you did know that writing and lighting a fire and driving a car are prohibited on Shabbos, you would only bring one sin offering, because what you were unaware of, right? What you were unaware of in your lapse of awareness is that it was Shabbos. You knew that those things were prohibited, but you didn't know it was Shabbos. In that situation, even though you did multiple things wrong, it was because of only one kind of unawareness that it was Shabbos, and so you'd only bring one sin offering. So Rav Yosef concludes his objection to Rabbi Abba's comparison between the status of the prohibition against kindling a fire on Shabbos and the status of the prohibition against bowing to an idol. Again, we know generally avodah zarah, idolatry, is prohibited, and we know generally that working on Shabbos is prohibited, but the Torah then specifies that kindling a fire is prohibited on Shabbos and that bowing to an idol is prohibited. Why specify one of the categories when we know that all of those categories are banned? And what are we learning out from this? So the fact that Rabbi Yosef derives that kindling a fire on Shabbos is not punishable by death can be attributed to the fact that he derives from a different verse that one who violates several categories of labor is obligated to bring a sin offering for each and every category of labor that he engages in. But here, with regard to idol worship, where he does not derive the division of labors, i.e. the division of categories of idol worship, from another verse, perhaps everyone agrees that bowing was singled out to divide the prohibition of idol worship into different categories, and bowing to an idol is punishable by death, just like other forms of worship. You can't generally compare the strategy of the Torah in saying all work on Shabbos is prohibited and then specifying that kindling a fire is prohibited, and that similarly all forms of idolatry are prohibited, and specifically bowing is prohibited. You can't say that just because with Shabbos we're going to learn that kindling was specified to teach you about the difference between unawareness that it's Shabbos versus unawareness that all those things are prohibited on Shabbos, and then learn out, therefore, that bowing was singled out of idolatry for the same reasons, because idolatry and Shabbos aren't the same, right? With idolatry, the only choice you have is to know or not know that those actions are prohibited. With Shabbos, there's two things that you could not know: that those actions are prohibited or that it's Shabbos. Except that they're going to come up with an example that makes it a little bit more comparable. So let's keep going. So the Gemara asks, let me make sure. Yeah. So the Gemara asks, I just want to make sure I didn't lose my place. Okay, hold on. Yeah. The Gemara asks, according to both opinions, that of Rav Abba and that of Rav Yosef, why not derive the division of labors with regard to idol worship, too, from the same verse from which Rabbi Yosef derives the divisions of labors with regard to Shabbos? Namely, this verse that we're talking about, Leviticus 4:2, from one of them. Why not learn it the same way, applying the same logic to idolatry as we did to Shabbos? Since this verse is not referring to the laws of Shabbos in particular, it can be interpreted with regard to the laws of idol worship in the same manner that it is interpreted with regard to Shabbos. The word one is referring to one complete prohibited act of worship, such as sacrificing an animal as an idolatrous offering. So the term from one is referring to one who performs part of an act of worship. For example, he did not finish slaughtering the offering. He started to shecht it, to slaughter the neck of the offering, but he didn't finish. He only got halfway through the neck. So he didn't finish. So did he commit idolatry or not? Hold on. Right. The term from one is referring to one who performs part of an act of worship. For example, one who did not finish slaughtering the offering, as he severed only one of the organs, meaning the windpipe and gullet. He only did one of them. The word them is referring to the primary categories of idol worship that are derived from the manner in which God is worshipped in the Holy Temple, namely sacrificing an animal as an offering, burning incense, pouring a libation, and bowing. And the term of them is referring to the subcategories of idol worship. For example, one who broke a stick before an idol that is worshipped in such a manner. Breaking a stick is a subcategory of sacrificing, as an animal's neck is broken when it is slaughtered, and we could compare that to one who breaks sticks before an idol, where the normal form of worshiping that idol is breaking sticks. Now, the principle of one transgression that with regard to punishment becomes many can be applied to a case of intention. awareness on the part of the transgressor that idol worship is prohibited, and unawareness that the particular rites of worship that he was performing are prohibited, and the principle of them, several transgressions that with regard to punishment are one, can be applied to a case of unawareness with regard to the prohibition of idol worship. For example, the transgressor was unaware that idol worship is prohibited or that he was worshiping an idol, and intention, i.e. awareness that the rites that he was performing are prohibited. So that sounds a little complicated. How could he know that, unaware? Yeah, how could he be unaware that idol worship is prohibited, but aware that this particular action is prohibited? Where is that going to come up? They're going to get some examples. The Gemara responds to the suggestion that the division of category of idol worship can be derived from this verse. What are the circumstances, right? What kind of example are we talking about? Of unawareness with regard to idol worship. So if the transgressor thought that a certain building was a synagogue and he bowed to it, and then he realized that it is a house of worship. Okay, so he didn't know that he was committing idolatry. He thought it was a synagogue, and so he was going to bow as a sign of respect to God. But it turns out that it wasn't a synagogue. It was actually a house of idolatry. So bowing to that house would constitute an act of idolatry. But his intention was to respect God by bowing toward a synagogue. So he was unaware that the building was a house of idolatry rather than a synagogue. So if the transgressor thought that a certain building was a synagogue and he bowed to it, and then he realized that it is a house of idol worship, well, he is completely exempt. He didn't do anything wrong, as his heart was directed toward heaven. There's no strict liability because it turned out that he bowed to a house of idolatry. He didn't think he was doing that. He was totally unaware. Rather, it must be a case where the transgressor saw a statue, andarta of a person, and he bowed to it. Well, this case must also be clarified. If he accepted that person upon himself as a god, then he's an intentional transgressor, and he's liable to receive the death penalty, not to bring an offering for unwitting transgression. If he did not accept this person upon himself as a god, but rather bowed to the statue in order to honor the person, then what he did is nothing. It wasn't any form of idolatry where he thinks he is committing idolatry. So rather, it is clearly a case where one worshipped an idol due to love or fear of someone, and he was unaware that this is prohibited. He knew he was committing idolatry. He was doing it because he was coerced, but coercion is not a defense for idolatry. You're not supposed to do it even if you're being coerced. And certainly not love, that to flatter someone or because you're being seduced by someone or just to show love to a human, you're going to go bow to the idol that human bows to, certainly prohibited. But this guy thinks that, but if I'm being coerced, it's okay. Or if I'm doing it out of, love for this other person, I don't really mean it as idolatry. I'm only doing it to further my relationship with this person. And he thinks that that's permitted. So is that going to work? Now, this works out well according to Abaye, who says that one who engages in idol worship due to love or fear is liable. Accordingly, one who does so unwittingly must bring an offering. But according to Rava, who says that one who does so is exempt, what can be said? In other words, the Rava and Abaye, who are Amoraim, great sages of the Gemara, they actually disagree. They have a machloket, where one of them says, if you're being coerced to commit idolatry, it's not idolatry. You didn't do it because you believe that idol is a god that you're serving. You're just, doing the action to further your relationship with that person, but you have no, sense in your heart that you're serving some god. So you think that it's permitted because it's a false action. That's according to Rava. So if that's the case, then why would we even bring this in? It's not a sin. According to Rava. According to Abaye, it would be. But according to Rava, it's not. So rather, according to Rava, unawareness with regard to idol worship can be explained as referring to a case where the transgressor says to himself that idol worship is permitted in general. He forgot that idol worship is prohibited. If so, one can resolve the dilemma that Rava raised before Rav Nachman. What is the law if one who violated Shabbos has a lapse of awareness of both this, that it's Shabbos, and that a particular labor that he performed is prohibited on Shabbos? That will be both. right? So we said that if you forgot it's Shabbos and you did multiple prohibited categories of labor, you'd only need to bring one sin offering. But if you knew it was Shabbos, but you forgot that these categories of labor are prohibited, you'd have to bring a sin offering for each of them. Well, what if you forgot both? You didn't know it was Shabbos, and you didn't know that these things are prohibited. How many sin offerings do you have to bring then? Rava's dilemma had been left unresolved. If the phrase, and performs one of them, is interpreted as referring to a case where one engages in idol worship, thinking that it is permitted to do so, well, then one can resolve that the transgressor is obligated to bring only one sin offering for all his acts of idol worship, according to this interpretation of the verse. And the fact that Rava's dilemma had been left unresolved, therefore serves as a challenge to this interpretation. This seems like an easy answer. If we said that Rava's dilemma was unresolved, it must be that it's not an easy answer. But the Gemara says, no, this is not difficult. Indeed, resolve the dilemma from there. We have an answer to Rava's dilemma, that if you forgot it was Shabbos and that these things are prohibited, he only brings one offering. We're going to learn out what to do in the consequences of that Shabbos situation from what we're learning here in the idolatry situation. Where we started was we're going to learn out what to do in an idolatry situation from the laws of Shabbos. So now we're going back the other way. The Gemara asks, can you interpret these verses, namely, and performs one of them, with regard to idolatry at all? As here in Leviticus chapter 4, where this verse is written, it is written with regard to an anointed priest, meaning the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, stating that if he sinned unwittingly, he brings a bull as a sin offering. And with regard to a king who sinned unwittingly, it is stated that he brings a goat as a sin offering. And with regard to an ordinary individual, it is stated that he brings a female lamb or a female goat. Right? So the general categories of sin offering for an unwitting transgression as it works out for a Kohen Gadol, for a king, and for an ordinary Jew. Whereas, with regard to idol worship, we learned in a Baraisa on page 61b, and they agree that a high priest who unwittingly engages in idol worship brings a female goat as a sin offering, same as an ordinary individual. Clearly then, the laws of unwitting idol worship are derived from a different source, meaning Numbers 15, not Leviticus 4. So the Gemara concludes, and there is nothing more to be discussed. The suggestion to derive a division of categories with regard to idolatry from the phrase in the verse and performs from one of them is groundless. And Rav Yosef's objection to Rabbi Abba's opinion is justified. So this line of attack on the logic problem didn't work. But we have not resolved our question yet. When Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, and now we're on page 62b, this is the Baraisa that Rabbi Zakkai taught before Rabbi Yochanan. There is a stringency with regard to Shabbos vis-a-vis other mitzvahs. Shabbos is more stringent than other mitzvahs in one way. And conversely, there is a stringency with regard to other mitzvahs vis-a-vis Shabbos. And in another way, other mitzvahs are more stringent than Shabbos. How so? So there is a stringency with regard to Shabbos. Shabbos is more stringent. As, with regard to Shabbos, if one performed two distinct acts of labor in one lapse of awareness, he is obligated to bring a sin offering for each and every act, which is not so with regard to other mitzvahs. Conversely, there is a stringency with regard to other mitzvahs. As with regard to other mitzvahs, if one sinned unwittingly, without intent to perform the act of the transgression at all, he is nevertheless obligated to bring a sin offering, which is not so with regard to Shabbos. Now that sounds like in that situation where the guy bows down to a synagogue. He thinks it's a synagogue, and he bows toward it as a sign of respect to God. He's not bowing to a building. He's bowing to God, but he's sort of, inspired to do that because he's looking at a synagogue. But then it turns out that that was not a synagogue. It was a house of Avodah Zarah, some kind of idolatrous temple. So if he knew it was an idolatrous temple and he bowed toward it, that's definitely idolatry, and he's guilty. So he did it thinking it was a synagogue. So he was unwittingly doing it. Sounds like he would have to bring the sin offering for that. Does he? We're going to come back. The Gemara examines this baraisa in detail. The master said, there is a stringency with regard to Shabbos, as with regard to Shabbos, if one performed two distinct acts of labor in one lapse of awareness, he's obligated to bring a sin offering for each act. What are the circumstances? If we say that he unwittingly performed acts of reaping and grinding on Shabbos, two different categories of labor that are prohibited, the corresponding situation with regard to other mitzvahs would be a case where one unwittingly consumed forbidden fat and blood. Right? So there's forbidden fat. There's a part of a cow that when you slaughter it, kosher slaughter, just for the purpose of eating the cow, there are parts of the cow that you cannot eat. You can't eat the sciatic nerve and what's around it. You can't eat these forbidden fats, a part of the fat that's not allowed, for sure in a sheep, I think in a cow also. And you can't drink its blood. You can't drink blood from a living animal. That's a separate prohibition. And you can't drink the blood of an animal that you slaughtered. You have to let the blood gush out on the ground, cover up the blood, and then you salt the meat so that you're not, even less. You're going to have even less blood that goes along with the meat, when you go and make your steaks and hamburgers. But forbidden fat and blood, there's two different prohibitions on that in the Torah that are spelled out. So if you ate both of these prohibited things from that same cow in one lapse of awareness, are you bringing two sin offerings or one? If so, there is no difference between Shabbos and other mitzvahs. If that's the case, then Shabbos is the same. That you have two different sin offerings because you reaped and grinded on one Shabbos, and you ate forbidden fat and blood, and that also requires two sin offerings. Okay, well then Shabbos and other mitzvahs are the same. If so, there is no difference between Shabbos and other mitzvahs. Here one is obligated to bring two sin offerings, and there one is obligated to bring sin offerings. So rather, what are the circumstances with regard to other mitzvahs, where one is obligated to bring only one sin offering? One is obligated in a case where he consumed forbidden fat, and he again consumed forbidden fat in one lapse of awareness. Okay, so he didn't know that these fats are forbidden, and he ate some of that, and then a few minutes later, he ate again. So there, it's only one sin offering, even though he had two different eatings. It was the same rule that he was breaking in the same lapse of awareness. Well, the corresponding situation with regard to Shabbos is a case where he performed an act of reaping, and then he performed another act of reaping within the same lapse of awareness. Well, in that case, too, there's no difference between Shabbos and the other mitzvahs. Here, one is obligated to bring one sin offering, and there one is obligated to bring one sin offering. Now, the Gemara comments, and that is the reason that Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Zakkai, go out and teach this baraisa outside. It is not worthy of being taught in the study hall. You got this all wrong, Rabbi Zakkai. But the Gemara says, what is the difficulty that caused Rabbi Yochanan to disregard the baraisa? Actually, perhaps I will say to you that the baraisa is referring to a case where one performed acts of reaping and grinding on Shabbos. And when the baraisa states, which is not so with regard to mitzvahs, it is not referring to all mitzvahs in general, but rather we arrive at the law of idol worship. Idol worship is going to be different. Bowing and sacrificing for an idol are going to be more similar to Shabbos, or going to be more distinguished from Shabbos, but are not going to occupy the same logic and niche as eating forbidden fat and eating blood. How so? We arrive at the laws of idol worship. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Ami. As Rabbi Ami says, if one sacrificed an animal as an idolatrous offering and burned incense and poured a libation, all in the course of one lapse of awareness, he is obligated to bring only one sin offering. Okay, Rabbi Zakkai has support from Rabbi Ami. Now there's two of them against Rabbi Yochanan. What's going on? But the Gemara answers, the baraisa cannot be interpreted as referring to idolatry, about the stringencies of Shabbos versus other mitzvahs and the stringencies of other mitzvahs versus Shabbos. No, this can't apply to idolatry. Why? As it teaches in the last clause, there is a stringency with regard to other mitzvahs, as with regard to other mitzvahs, if one sinned unwittingly, without the intent to perform the act at all, he is nevertheless obligated to bring an offering. And now the Gemara explains why this cannot be referring to idolatry. What are the circumstances of one who unwittingly transgresses the prohibition of idol worship without the intent to perform the act? If he thought that a house of idolatry was a synagogue and he bowed to it, he is exempt, as his heart was directed toward heaven. If he knew it was a house of idolatry and he bowed to it, that's idolatry. But he thought he was bowing toward God. He was not committing an act of idolatry. He was not trying to betray God. In fact, he was trying to honor God. He made a mistake, but he was trying to honor God. Rather, it must be a case where the transgressor saw the statue of a person and he bowed to it. But if he accepted that person upon himself as a god, then he's an intentional transgressor, and he can't bring a sin offering. But if he did not accept that person upon himself as a god, then what he did is nothing. He's just showing respect to a neighbor who had a statue made of himself. Now, rather, the Baraisa must be referring to a case where one worshipped an idol due to love or fear of a person, and he was unaware that this is prohibited. And this works out well according to Abaye, who says that one who engages in idol worship due to love or fear is liable. Accordingly, one who does so unwittingly must bring an offering. But according to the view of Rava, who says that one who does so is exempt, then what can be said? So rather, the Baraisa must be referring to a case where the transgressor says to himself that idol worship is permitted in general. He forgot that idolatry is prohibited. Accordingly, the statement in the Baraisa, which is not so in the laws of Shabbos, is referring to one who was under the impression that performing labor on Shabbos is permitted. He forgot that doing work on Shabbos is prohibited. Well, one who performs prohibited labor under these circumstances is completely exempt, while one who transgresses under those circumstances with regard to idol worship, one is obligated to bring a sin offering. Wait, what? If he forgot that labor in general is prohibited on Shabbos and he performs labor, he's exempt? I don't think we're saying that. Let's keep going. The interpretation of the Baraisa is difficult. As Rava asked Rav Nachman about the law in a case where one violated Shabbos during a lapse of awareness of both this, that it was Shabbos, and that the particular labor that he performed is prohibited on Shabbos. And Rava's question was only with regard to whether to deem the person obligated to bring one offering or whether to deem him obligated to bring two sin offerings. But no one suggested that he brings no offerings. There is no one who says that such a person is entirely exempt in accordance with this interpretation of the Baraisa. Therefore, the Baraisa cannot be referring to idol worship. Now, the Gemara challenges this conclusion. What do you mean? What's the difficulty in interpreting the Baraisa as referring to idol worship? Actually, perhaps I will say to you that the first clause of the Baraisa is referring to the contrast between Shabbos and idol worship, and the last clause is referring to the contrast between Shabbos and other mitzvahs. So the Baraisa shifted ground in the middle of the Baraisa. And the law of one who transgressed other mitzvahs unwittingly without intent to perform the act is referring to, for example, a case where one has forbidden fat in his mouth and he thinks it is something else, like spittle, and he swallows it. He knew he was swallowing. He didn't know he was swallowing forbidden fat. In that case, he must bring an offering for his transgression, which is not so with regard to the laws of Shabbos, where in a parallel case, one would be exempt. As for example, one who intended to lift a plant that was detached from the ground and mistakenly severed a plant still attached to the ground is exempt. One is not liable for an unintentional act of labor on Shabbos. Unintentional is not the same as unwitting, right? If one does labor on Shabbos and he didn't know it was Shabbos, or he does prohibited labor on Shabbos and he didn't know that that labor was prohibited, okay, he knew he was doing that labor. He was reaping, or he was grinding, or he was writing. What he didn't know is that it was Shabbos, or he didn't know that that was prohibited on Shabbos. That's going to result in bringing a sin offering. But one who just intended to lift up a potted plant, right? You can do that on Shabbos. You can move a potted plant on Shabbos. Let's say that you're in a dining room and extra guests come and you just need to move this potted plant to the side so you can put a chair there and have another guest at your Shabbos table. Absolutely, you can do that. But what if you're doing this outside? You're eating in the outdoor table and you move that potted plant in order to make room at your Shabbos table. And then it turns out that that potted plant that had been sitting on that place in the dirt for a long time, there was a hole in the bottom of the pot. And some of the roots of that potted plant went through the hole and into the ground. So when you move the potted plant, you actually detached a plant that was rooted in the ground. That's reaping or harvesting. That's prohibited on Shabbos. But you didn't intend to reap. You didn't intend to pull a plant out of the ground. You didn't know it was attached to the ground. That's a different kind of unawareness, so to speak. That's an unintentional act. You didn't mean to do that at all. It's not that you didn't know it was prohibited. It's that something happened that it wasn't what you were intending to do. That's a different category. And this distinction, I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And this distinction is in accordance with the statement that Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says, as he says, one who acts unawares with forbidden fats, or with those with whom sexual relations are forbidden, i.e. who accidentally consume forbidden fat, right? He thought he was eating just gum or spittle. He didn't know that there was forbidden fat in his mouth. Or he engaged in forbidden sexual intercourse without intending to perform the act at all. That was that crazy case where somebody falls off a roof and lands in coitus. We need a case like that so we can evaluate the situation. Is obligated to bring a sin offering since he derives pleasure from the transgression. Okay, he didn't mean to fall off a roof and suddenly land in a lovemaking situation. But once he was there, he got pleasure out of it. So he had no intention to commit the act, but since he got pleasure out of it, he would bring a sin offering. But one who acts unawares on Shabbos, performing forbidden labor, is exempt as the Torah prohibits only planned labor. The potted plant situation. Now, since the Baraisa can be explained in this manner, the Gemara explains why Rabbi Yochanan rejected it anyway. Rabbi Yochanan conforms to his standard line of reasoning in that he does not interpret the first clause of a Baraisa with one explanation and the last clause of the same Baraisa with some other explanation. Rabbi Yochanan does not accept the premise that a Baraisa can be referring to a different matter in each clause unless that Baraisa states so explicitly. As Rabbi Yochanan says, whoever explains to me the Mishnah concerning a barrel, which was on Bava Metzia 40b, in accordance with the opinion of one Tana, I will carry his clothes after him to the bathhouse, i.e. I will attend him as a servant, as although that Mishnah can be explained by dividing it into two different opinions, I do not accept that type of explanation. Right? In that Baraisa, the only way to understand it, because it contradicts itself. And so they say, oh, okay, well, this was one Tana was stating the first half, and a different Tana was stating the second half, even though it doesn't say that. So Rabbi Yochanan is like, well, if it was two different people speaking, it would have said that. Instead, you have to explain that there was some other, there's some other way to understand that this seeming contradiction of one person versus himself is not a contradiction, but nobody could figure that out. So that's why Rabbi Yochanan was looking for that answer. From that, we know that Rabbi Yochanan does not accept the suggestion that the first clause of the Baraisa here is referring to idol worship, but the last clause is referring to some other mitzvahs. And that's where we'll start tonight. We'll take some questions, and then we'll continue tomorrow. Okay. Joseph, hypothetically, if you noticed an idolatrous statue in a vegan restaurant, would that be a violation to eat there, or would you need to participate in the ritual? It's a good question. And I'll tell you where else that comes up. A lot of people like to do yoga. And sometimes in a yoga studio, there will be what is definitely an idolatrous statue. Can you go and do yoga there? So the two sides of the argument, you don't care about that statue, and you don't consider that your yoga practice, which you're doing for exercise and good health, is in any way honoring that idol. On the other hand, you're in the same room with that idol, and maybe there's other people in the room that bow to the idol. You don't. They do. Is it problematic to go there? I'm not sure. I haven't looked this up in a while, but as I recall, mixed opinions. Some, stringent people would just find a different yoga studio to go to and a different vegan restaurant to go to, and others would say, "Hey, I could care less about the idol. That's not why I'm there. I'm certainly not going to show any deference or respect to that idol." Now, if the owners of that restaurant were running a religious operation that was raising money for their idolatrous temple, you should not eat there. I'm pretty sure. But I'd have to talk to a rabbi to get more specific on this. I'm not a rabbi, and I'm definitely not a poskening rabbi. Bill. Now, this raises a question about statuary of rulers. Let us say the following. It is customary in a certain pagan kingdom to erect statues of the current ruler in the public square. 2. It is customary in this country for these statues of rulers to be saluted as a sign of respect. They also salute the statues of their gods, but these pagans do not worship their living kings and believe a king who seeks to be a living god is committing terrible hubris and should be struck down. So they draw a firm line between the statues to the king's statue and those of the gods. However, it is customary for dead kings to be deified. Good, Bill. You're drawing all these circumstances. Very good. Very Talmudic. Now, in this country, there lives a certain Jew. He salutes the statue of the king as he passes because it's easier to blend in with the population that way. However, unknown to the Jew, the king has died overnight. He was, of course, immediately declared a god by his son, the new king. So, this Jew just performed an action that yesterday was not idolatry, but today is. What is his liability? Now, if we compare it to bowing to the synagogue, which turns out not to be a synagogue, we said that he was exempt because his heart was directed toward heaven, right? If he bowed toward a building just because, it was the building owned by the king and he likes the, policies of that king, and so he was just bowing out of respect, then I think we're at your situation, right? That's exactly your situation. So there seems to be a distinction between bowing toward a synagogue and bowing toward something else, thinking it's something else, and then it turns out to be a temple of idolatry. So it sounds like in your situation, probably he does bring the sin offering, but I was comparing it to that synagogue example. Now we talk about the statues example, where if he's just bowing, to a statue as a sign of respect, to somebody he cares about, that's considered nothing. But now it turns out that he was never accepting it as God upon himself, and that's why it's nothing. But now it turns out that those statues have become like gods for other people. Bill, good question. Good question. I'm not sure. I think there's going to be two sides to this, where you could say, are we going to say that unwitting is this a love or fear situation, which according to Abaye is prohibited, and therefore he does bring the offering in the case that you've made? Or are we going to hold like Rava that he's exempt? I think we hold like Abaye, so probably he brings the offering. It's certainly not intentional, Avodah Zarah. I think he probably does bring it, but I'm not sure. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night. Good vach.